Hi everyone. Tonight we're trading in your mattress for a straw-stuffed one, your smoke detector for absolutely nothing, and your quiet evening for the sound of church bells, seagulls, and someone, somewhere, always frying fish. Welcome to Lisbon, capital of the Portuguese Empire, in the spring of the year 1755. Back when this city was one of the richest, holiest, and most gorgeously chaotic places on the entire planet, and not one single person in it had any idea what the calendar had planned for later that year. This is not the pastel-tiled postcard version with the vintage trams. This is the original. Steeper, louder, and considerably more devout. Before we start wandering these hills together, a small favour. If you enjoy these slow wanders through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, purely because it helps the channel find more people like you, and for no other reason I'll lose sleep over. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're tucked in tonight and what absurd hour it happens to be there, because apparently bedtime never agrees on a single time zone. And if you'd rather just close your eyes and listen without the screen, we're on Spotify too. Links waiting in the description. All right? Get yourself comfortable, let your shoulders drop, dim whatever needs dimming, and let your whole body agree that nothing at all is required of it right now. Let's sit with a few questions before we go. Could you haggle over a basket of sardines at dawn without losing a shred of your dignity? Would you know what to do if a voice above you shouted a single warning word right before something unspeakable came sailing out a window? Could you sit through 3 hours of Latin Mass in your itchiest black wool without once shifting in your seat? Would you survive being introduced to actual Portuguese nobility without instinctively reaching for a phone that won't exist for another 250 years? And could you fall asleep tonight in a city this gilded, this devout, and this quietly convinced of its own permanence, without once giving a thought to the ground underneath you? Well, congratulations. You've just opened your eyes in Lisbon in the spring of 1755. The gold is real, the churches are enormous, the fish stinks magnificently, and the ground, for now, is staying exactly where it's supposed to. Let's make the most of it while it does. Open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is that nothing in this city is flat. Lisbon is built across 7 steep hills, the same boastful number Rome likes to claim, and every single street seems to have opinions about your calf muscles. Whitewashed houses stack on top of each other like they're queuing for a view of the river, red-tiled roofs catching the morning light, and somewhere below you, a bell is already ringing for reasons nobody bothers to explain to visitors. You'll learn quickly that Lisbon does not believe in gentle inclines. A street here doesn't rise, it lunges, and the locals have adapted the way people adapt to anything unavoidable, which is to say, they've simply stopped noticing. Merchants haul barrels up these slopes without breaking stride. Children chase each other straight up staircases carved into the hillside as if gravity were a rumour from somewhere else. You, on the other hand, are already regretting several life choices before breakfast. The neighbourhoods stack themselves according to their own private logic. Up on the hills sit the older, tangled quarters, alleys so narrow that neighbours can pass a cup of wine window to window without either of them leaving their chair. Down by the water sprawls the newer, grander Lisbon, wide squares and gilded churches built to impress anyone arriving by ship, which, this being one of the busiest ports on earth, is a great many people indeed. The city, in other words, wears its wealth downhill and its history uphill. And you'll be climbing between the two more than you'd like. Ever tried to power walk up a spiral staircase while a stranger's laundry drips on your head from 3 stories up? That is essentially a morning commute here, except the staircase is a street and the laundry is considered a courtesy rather than an inconvenience. There is no elevator, no escalator, and no sympathy. There is only the hill and your own 2 legs, and the faint suspicion that whoever founded this city on 7 hills did so specifically to punish future tourists. What makes it bearable, oddly, is the view. Round a corner gasping for breath, and the whole harbour opens up beneath you. Ships at anchor, red roofs cascading down to blue water. The kind of panorama that makes you forget, for just a moment, that your legs currently hate you. Lisbon rewards suffering with scenery, which is either a very generous trade or an extremely calculated one. Either way, you'll take it, because you don't have much choice, and neither did anyone who's ever lived here. So you climb, you pause, you climb again, already sweating in your travel clothes while the locals stroll past unbothered, and you begin to understand the first rule of this city. Lisbon was never built for convenience. It was built for a view, and it fully expects you to earn it, one merciless hill at a time. Let's talk about the water, because without it, none of this exists. The Tagus River widens here into a harbour so vast and calm that sailors have called it one of the finest natural ports in the world. Wide enough to hide 100 ships and deep enough to float them all the way from Brazil, India, and Africa without so much as scraping the bottom. Stand at the water's edge and you'll see exactly what that means in practice. Masts crowd the horizon like a leafless forest. Ships from Lisbon itself, but also from England, the Netherlands, and half the trading nations of Europe, all jostling for a berth along a waterfront that never seems to run out of cargo to unload. Crates of sugar, barrels of wine, sacks of spice, and, if you know where to look, chests that arrive under considerably heavier guard than the rest. Because what's inside them is the reason this entire city can afford to be this beautiful. The smell here is its own kind of education. Salt water, tar, wet rope, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of the river itself, mixed with wood smoke drifting down from the hillside kitchens. Gulls scream overhead, competing with dock workers shouting in at least 4 languages, and somewhere a ship's bell clangs out a rhythm that has nothing to do with the church bells still ringing behind you. It is loud, briny, and utterly alive, the kind of soundscape that never actually stops, just changes shifts. Think of the Tagus as Lisbon's motorway, except instead of trucks, you have caravels, and instead of traffic jams, you have entire fleets waiting their turn to dock, sometimes for days, their crews drinking away their wages in waterfront taverns while cargo rots gently in the hold. Ever sat in traffic so long you started wondering if it would just be faster to walk? Sailors here have had that exact thought, except walking home means crossing an ocean. The river doesn't just carry goods either. It carries the entire reason Lisbon exists at the centre of a global empire, rather than as a modest fishing town with excellent views. Everything that makes this city rich, the gold, the spices, the sugar, arrives first as a smudge on the horizon and a whisper down at the docks before it ever reaches a noble's table or a church altar. The Tagus is patient that way. It has been quietly making Lisbon wealthy for centuries and asks for nothing in return except the occasional shipwreck. So you stand there a while longer, watching the sails shift in the wind, the small fishing boats weaving between the larger merchant ships like children darting between adults at a party. The river doesn't care that you're a visitor. It has cargo to move and tides to keep, but it's given you, for a moment, a fairly honest introduction to the city behind you. Gorgeous, busy, and entirely dependent on water it never once bothers to thank. Morning here does not arrive quietly. It arrives in layers. First the roosters, then the church bells, then the creak of shutters being thrown open, and finally the low mutter of servants already 3 chores deep into a day you haven't technically started yet. You lie there for a moment, listening to a city clear its throat. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a wooden frame strung with rope or webbing, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw or wool, depending on how kindly fate has treated you. It rustles every time you move, which is often, because straw has opinions about comfort, and none of them align with yours. A thin blanket is doing most of the heavy lifting against the morning chill, and somewhere near your feet, if you're unlucky, something small and many-legged has already claimed squatting rights for the night. You have made peace with this. You had to. The room itself is modest by most standards you'd recognize. Shuttered windows rather than glass in poorer households, a chamber pot tucked discreetly in the corner, awaiting its unglamorous journey to the street later this morning, and walls thin enough that you can hear your neighbour's rooster before you can hear your own thoughts. Wealthier households have glass, tapestries, and considerably more privacy, but you, this morning, are not wealthy. You are simply awake and slightly damp with sweat because Lisbon mornings warm quickly and nobody here has invented the concept of ventilation as a design priority. Ever been woken up by a neighbour's alarm through paper-thin apartment walls and silently plotted a mild revenge? Multiply that by roosters, bells, and a donkey somewhere down the lane who has clearly decided this is the hour for complaints. Lisbon does not ease you into consciousness. It simply arrives, all at once, like a large, enthusiastic dog. Breakfast, such as it is, tends to be simple. Bread, perhaps some cheese or fruit if the household can spare it, washed down with watered wine because the water itself is not always to be trusted on its own. There is no lingering over coffee and headlines here, mostly because coffee hasn't yet become the daily ritual it will later be, and headlines require a printing press with better distribution habits than the local one currently has. You eat quickly because the day, much like the hill outside your window, has no intention of waiting for you. Outside, the city is already in motion. Servants haul water up from the fountains, shopkeepers throw open their shutters, and somewhere a priest is already halfway through the first mass of the day, because in Lisbon, faith gets up earlier than almost everyone else. You splash water on your face, adjust your clothes, and step toward the door, already slightly behind schedule in a city that runs, stubbornly and constantly, on the rhythm of its bells. So you rise, rope bed creaking its farewell, and step out into a morning that has been awake far longer than you have. The rooster will not apologize.
The bells will not pause, and somewhere down the hill, the real business of the city, fish, gold, gossip, and God, is already well underway without you. It's time to meet the toughest women in Lisbon, and they are not the nobility. Down by the riverside market, the varinas balance woven baskets of fresh sardines directly on top of their heads, walking for miles through the city without spilling so much as a scale, hollering out prices in a tone that suggests negotiation is not actually on the table. Watch one closely and you'll understand why nobody argues too hard.
A varina loads her basket at dawn, straight from the boats. Sometimes 40 or 50 pounds of glistening fish, balanced with nothing but posture and sheer stubborn practice. Then sets off uphill through streets that have already personally offended your knees this morning. She does this without a hand touching the basket, spine straight, hips swaying just enough to keep the whole arrangement level. Climbing staircases that would have you gasping into a wall for support. It is, quite simply, one of the most impressive feats of physical engineering you will witness all day. And she is doing it while also insulting a customer's haggling technique. The smell announces her before she rounds the corner. Brine and fresh fish and the faint tang of the river she just left. Her voice follows a beat later, a rhythmic musical cry advertising the day's catch. Sardines, mackerel, whatever swam into a net that morning. Pitched loud enough to carry over roosters, bells, and church processions alike. Buyers lean out of windows or step into doorways, and the transaction that follows is less a conversation than a performance. Quick, sharp, occasionally theatrical, and always ending with the varina getting approximately the price she wanted from the start. Ever watched a food delivery cyclist weave through city traffic, balancing 3 bags and a phone, while somehow still beating your estimated arrival time? That's the varina's energy. Except she's also carrying dinner for half the neighbourhood on her skull, and has strong opinions about your character if you try to lowball her. These women are not incidental to Lisbon's food supply. They are the backbone of it. Fresh fish spoils fast in the heat climbing off these hillsides, so speed matters. And the varinas have turned distribution into both a livelihood and something close to an art form. Passed down from mother to daughter, along with the particular hip sway required to keep a basket steady on cobblestones that seem personally designed to test balance. Their calls have become so woven into the daily soundtrack of the city that a morning without them would feel, to any local, less like peace and more like something had gone quietly wrong. There is a toughness to the work that goes well beyond the physical. These are women running small, independent businesses in a city that otherwise offers them very few paths to economic independence, setting their own prices, managing their own routes, answering to no landlord or husband while the basket is on their head. It's easy to romanticize from a safe distance, and considerably harder to actually do. Hill after hill, day after day, rain or shine, or, on the worst days, both. So you step aside as one strides past, sardines glinting silver in the morning sun, voice carrying effortlessly over the noise of the street. She doesn't spare you a glance. She has fish to sell and hills to conquer. And unlike you, she has absolutely no intention of stopping to catch her breath. Let's talk about dinner. Because in Lisbon, there is a very good chance it involves salt cod. Fishermen have been hauling this stuff back from the cold waters near Newfoundland for generations, packing it in salt to survive the voyage home. And the result is a national obsession, so devoted that people here claim to have a different recipe for every day of the year. Before it ever reaches your plate, that cod has to be rescued from its own preservation. Salted and dried until it's stiff as a plank and about as appetizing to look at, it needs a long soak, sometimes a full day or two. Water changed again and again before it softens back into something you'd actually want to eat. Kitchens across the city keep a hunk of it permanently on hand, soaking away in a bucket by the hearth, which means the faint, briny smell of rehydrating fish is simply part of the ambient air in most Lisbon homes, whether you asked for it or not. Once it's ready, the cooking itself ranges from humble to genuinely elaborate. Boiled with potatoes and cabbage for a simple weekday meal, layered into casseroles with eggs and onions for something more festive, or shredded and fried into crisp little fritters sold hot from street stalls. The smell of the oil alone enough to lure you 3 streets over. The texture, once properly prepared, turns flaky and tender, salty in a way that makes the accompanying wine feel less like an indulgence and more like a structural necessity. Ever kept a single ingredient in your pantry so long and used it so many different ways that you started to suspect your own creativity was less inspiration and more desperation? That is essentially the national relationship with salt cod. Except here, it's treated less as desperation and more as devotion, verging on scripture. Part of the appeal is practical. Fresh fish spoils fast, especially climbing these hills in the heat. But salted cod keeps for months without so much as a shrug, which made it an ideal food for a seafaring, Catholic nation that also observes a great many fasting days on which meat is off the table entirely. Cod, conveniently, does not count as meat under those rules, which turned what began as a preservation trick into something close to a dietary loophole blessed by the Church itself. The fishing voyages themselves are brutal. Months at sea in small boats off a coast thousands of miles from home, hauling in cod by hand in freezing water, salting the catch on deck before it even has time to properly die. The men who do this work return home leathery, exhausted, and richer than when they left, assuming the sea has been kind, which it frequently is not. So you sit down to your plate of cod, potatoes, and a drizzle of good olive oil, and you understand, finally, why an entire nation has built its culinary identity around a fish that has to travel further to reach your table than most of the people eating it ever will in their lifetime. It is salty, it is humble, and it is, without question, absolutely delicious. Now for the part of Lisbon nobody puts on the postcards. With no proper sewer system to speak of, household waste has one main exit route, straight out the upper story window and into the street below. A polite household shouts a warning first. A less polite household simply lets gravity make the announcement for them. The phrase itself, agua vai, water's coming, is meant as a courtesy, a heads-up shouted down into the dark before the contents of a chamber pot make their unceremonious journey to street level. Whether anyone below actually hears it in time is another matter entirely. And the streets themselves bear the evidence of many, many missed warnings. You learn quickly to walk with your eyes constantly flicking upward, scanning windows the way you might check a crosswalk signal. Except the stakes here are considerably less dignified than a jaywalking ticket. The timing tends to cluster around early morning and late evening, which means a nighttime stroll through certain neighborhoods requires the reflexes of a person dodging something considerably worse than rain. The smell lingers afterward in the narrow lanes, mixing with wood smoke, fish, and whatever the day's cooking happened to involve, creating an olfactory experience that visitors from cleaner cities tend to describe using words their mothers would not approve of. Ever lived below a neighbour who does laundry at exactly the wrong hour and dripped on repeatedly against your will? Now imagine that neighbour is several floors up. The laundry is considerably less pleasant, and there is no polite way to complain about it afterward. This is the actual texture of urban sanitation in a city this size, this crowded, and this proudly, stubbornly uninterested in modern plumbing. To be fair to Lisbon, this isn't laziness so much as scale. A city packed onto steep hills with narrow, twisting streets was never going to be an easy candidate for underground sewage systems, and most cities of comparable size across Europe are managing their waste in roughly similar, unglamorous ways. Paris has its own reputation to defend on this front. London is no innocent bystander either. Lisbon is simply doing what everyone else is doing, just with better acoustics thanks to all these hills. There are efforts at order, official designated hours, fines for particularly careless offenders, and city officials who occasionally attempt to regulate the whole business with limited success. Mostly, though, the system relies on a shared understanding between neighbours, a little courtesy, a little luck, and a lot of very fast walking for anyone caught in the wrong alley at the wrong hour. So you walk on, slightly more alert than before, eyes flicking upward at every shuttered window, newly appreciative of a detail from your own century you never once thought to be grateful for. Somewhere behind you, a voice calls out its warning, and somewhere below that voice, someone is sprinting. Since indoor plumbing is a luxury this century hasn't gotten around to inventing yet, water has to be carried, uphill, by hand, all day long. Many of the men doing this back-breaking work have travelled here from Galicia in northern Spain, hauling barrels and jugs up Lisbon's merciless slopes for a living, and somehow they never seem to be the ones complaining about the hills. You find them clustered around the public fountains scattered throughout the city, filling wooden barrels or clay jugs from the flowing spouts before hoisting the load onto a shoulder yoke or directly onto their backs, then setting off up streets that have already humbled you twice this morning. A full barrel is no small weight, and yet these men move with the steady, unbothered rhythm of people who have simply decided complaining wastes energy better spent climbing. The fountains themselves are small gathering points of city life. Women filling smaller jugs for household cooking, gossip trading hands as freely as coins, children splashing where they're not supposed to, while someone's grandmother scolds them without ever actually looking up. The water itself runs cool and clear from underground springs and aqueducts feeding into the city, a genuine relief in the growing heat of the day, and for a moment, the fountain square feels less like infrastructure and more like the actual living room of the neighbourhood. Ever paid a small fortune for bottled water delivered to your door and felt, just for a second, oddly pampered by the convenience? That delivery guy has nothing on a Galician water carrier, climbing 6 flights of open-air stairs with 40 pounds of liquid on his back, sweating through his shirt, and still managing a polite nod to the varina he passes coming the other way. These water carriers, known locally simply by their trade, have become such a fixture of the city that certain fountains and certain routes belong almost exclusively to certain crews, an informal system of territory and reputation built entirely on reliability and physical endurance. Wealthier households pay for regular delivery. Poorer ones send their own children down with jugs, small figures weaving through the crowd with a container half their own size, spilling a little more each block despite their best efforts. It is unglamorous work, unrecognised by any noble title, and unrewarded by any particular comfort, and yet the entire city depends on it completely. No cooking happens without it, no laundry gets washed, no thirst gets quenched on a hillside, baking gently under the Portuguese sun. The aqueducts and springs do the easy part, delivering water to the fountains. Everything after that, every single flight of stairs between the spout and someone's kitchen, rests on the back of a man who left home in Galicia specifically because this brutal, essential work paid better than whatever waited for him there. So you watch one pass, barrel steady, breath even, disappearing around the next bend upward, and you're reminded, not for the last time today, that Lisbon's beauty rests quite literally on the backs of people the postcards will never think to mention. Before you step outside, you'll need to get dressed properly, because Lisbon in 1755 is not a city that tolerates being caught looking casual. Black is fashionable, modesty is mandatory, and women of a certain standing are expected to cover themselves with a veil or mantle the moment they cross the threshold, transforming a simple walk to church into a full costume production. For women, this typically means the manto, a heavy cloak or veil draped to cover the head and much of the face, leaving perhaps one eye free to actually navigate the street, an arrangement that manages to be both modest and, depending on who's watching, quietly flirtatious in the way a single visible eye somehow always is. Underneath, layers of skirts and a fitted bodice, all in dark, sombre fabrics, regardless of the growing warmth of the day, because fashion here answers to propriety long before it answers to comfort. Men fare only slightly better in the heat department. A proper gentleman wears a long coat, waistcoat, breeches and stockings, topped with a hat that would be considered aggressively overdressed for a beach city at any other point in history, but which here signals exactly the right amount of respectability. Wigs, powdered and formal, sit heavy and warm atop heads that are already sweating through several layers of wool and linen, all in the name of looking appropriately serious for a stroll to the market. Ever put on a full suit for a video call, shirt and tie included, despite the fact that the camera only shows you from the collarbone up? Lisbon fashion operates on a similar logic, except here the entire outfit is visible, entirely mandatory, and worn in a climate that seems personally invested in making you regret it. Colour, or the near total absence of it, carries its own message. Black and dark, muted tones dominate, not out of some collective mourning, but because sombre colours read as pious, respectable, and appropriately restrained, values this deeply Catholic city prizes above almost anything else, including, apparently, the basic human right to be cool in summer. Bright colours and elaborate patterns exist, certainly, among the wealthiest households and on festival days, but the daily uniform of the streets leans dark, heavy, and serious. The veil itself deserves special mention because it does more social work than almost any other garment in the city. A woman properly veiled can move through public space with a degree of protected anonymity, observing without necessarily being fully observed in return, participating in the life of the street while maintaining the modesty her position demands. It is restrictive, certainly, and also, in its own strange way, a kind of built-in privacy screen that the modern world has largely lost, for better or worse. So you fasten your own layers, adjust whatever veil or hat your particular station requires, and step out feeling somehow both overdressed and completely correct for the occasion, because in this city, looking appropriately serious is not vanity. It is, quite literally, the price of admission to public life. Let's wander into the oldest part of the city, a tangle of narrow lanes and stairways so tight in places that two people can barely pass without becoming better acquainted than either intended. Alfama has been here since the days of Moorish rule, and it shows in every archway and courtyard, a neighbourhood that feels like it was built for whispering rather than walking. The streets twist without warning, doubling back on themselves, narrowing to a single-file squeeze between whitewashed walls before suddenly opening onto a tiny sunlit courtyard where someone's laundry hangs overhead like a string of surrender flags. There is no logic here that a modern map would recognise, no neat grid, no straight lines, just centuries of buildings leaning companionably against one another, added and altered and rebuilt in whatever shape best suited the hillside at the time. This neighbourhood survived largely untouched when Christian forces retook the city centuries ago, precisely because it was the poorer, less desirable quarter that nobody particularly wanted to knock down and rebuild, which means the layout underfoot still carries the fingerprints of North African urban design. Tight, shaded, defensible streets meant to keep the brutal summer sun at bay and keep neighbours close enough to help one another at a moment's notice. Fishermen and dock workers make their homes here in tightly packed houses, several families sometimes sharing a single building stacked floor upon floor, laundry and conversation drifting easily between windows close enough to touch. Someone is always singing, always arguing, always cooking something that smells extraordinary, and the whole neighbourhood carries a warmth that feels less like architecture and more like an extended family that simply happens to share a postal address. Ever gotten pleasantly, hopelessly lost in the old quarter of a foreign city? Phone dead, map useless, charmed despite your growing panic.
Alfama invented that feeling long before your phone existed to fail you in it. Every alley looks identical to the last one until, quite suddenly, it doesn't. And you find yourself standing in front of a church that's been there for 600 years with absolutely no memory of how you arrived. The steepness that punishes your legs elsewhere in the city reaches its peak here. Staircases carved directly into the rock, alleys so tight that a laden donkey occasionally becomes a temporary and inconvenient roadblock for an entire street. Yet the community that has grown up around this impossible geography has turned the inconvenience into intimacy. Neighbours know everything about one another, for better and for worse, because privacy simply isn't an option when your kitchen window faces directly into somebody else's. At night, the quarter grows quieter, but never silent. Guitar strings and low singing drifting from open doorways, voices carrying farther than they should through streets built like natural amplifiers. It is poor by the city's own economic standards, and unmistakably, stubbornly rich in something the grander neighbourhoods downhill can't quite manufacture, no matter how much Brazilian gold they spend trying. So you let yourself get lost a while longer, tracing your fingers along sun-warmed stone walls older than most nations. And you begin to understand that Alfama isn't a neighbourhood you visit so much as a neighbourhood you briefly, gratefully, get to overhear. Down at the water's edge sits the grandest address in the entire kingdom, the Ribeira Palace, home to King José I and a small army of courtiers, chaplains, and people whose entire job seems to be standing near the king, looking useful. It stretches directly along the Tagus, gilded, enormous, and built as if the ocean itself were meant to admire it. Approach from the water, and the scale of the thing becomes properly clear. Wing after wing of stone and stucco, terraces overlooking the river, a private chapel grand enough to double as a cathedral, and a library the royal family has spent generations quietly stuffing with tens of thousands of volumes, maps, and manuscripts. A collection that would make any modern archivist weep with either joy or jealousy, depending on their disposition.
Tapestries drape the walls inside. Gold leaf catches whatever light manages to sneak through heavy drapery. And somewhere deep within, musicians are almost certainly rehearsing for whatever opera the king has decided he simply must hear performed again this week. Life inside runs on a rhythm so ceremonial, it makes modern office hierarchy look positively egalitarian. Servants and courtiers move through an intricate, unspoken code of who bows to whom, who may speak first, who eats at which table, and who is permitted to simply exist in the same room as the king without express invitation. A single misplaced gesture at court can ripple into gossip for weeks. It is, in essence, an extremely well-dressed, extremely tense game of workplace politics, except the stakes involve entire noble families rather than a corner office. Ever sat in a meeting where everyone seemed to be silently competing over who could look busiest and most important without actually doing anything? The Ribeira Palace runs on precisely that energy, scaled up to imperial proportions, with velvet, incense, and a genuine belief that God is personally invested in the seating chart. King José himself is known to prefer music and spectacle over the grinding daily business of governance, which he has largely delegated to his chief minister, a sharp, ambitious man named Sebastião de Carvalho e Melo, who will, in time, become rather more famous than almost anyone currently residing in this palace, though nobody here has any particular reason to suspect that yet. For now, the king's attention is largely fixed on his beloved opera, his hunting excursions, and the pleasant business of being enormously, effortlessly rich. The palace treasury holds a share of the gold and diamonds still arriving weekly from Brazil, and very little of that subtlety translates into the building's decor, which practically vibrates with gilt, silk, and imported marble. Every surface seems engineered to remind a visitor, gently but unmistakably, exactly whose kingdom they are currently standing in. So you stand at a respectful distance, watching servants hurry past with trays and messages, catching a snatch of rehearsal music drifting from an open window somewhere above, and you understand quite clearly that this building was never meant to be lived in quietly. It was built to be seen, admired, and never, under any circumstances, doubted. Let's talk about where all this money actually comes from, because Lisbon in 1755 is drowning in it. Ships arrive from Brazil loaded with gold and diamonds, funneled through the royal trading houses along the waterfront, and the sheer scale of the wealth flowing into this city has made it one of the richest capitals in all of Europe. The gold itself comes from Minas Gerais, a region deep in the Brazilian interior, where deposits so rich were discovered decades ago that entire towns sprang up overnight around the diggings, populated by prospectors, enslaved labourers forced into the brutal work of extraction, and merchants eager to profit from every stage in between. Diamonds followed soon after, discovered almost by accident, and the crown moved quickly to claim a strict monopoly over their trade, because a king does not build an opera house on modest margins. Ships arrive at the Lisbon docks, laden with chests bearing the royal seal, unloaded under close guard before being carried directly to the treasury, where officials weigh, tax, and record every ounce before it disappears into palace coffers, church commissions, and the pockets of merchants clever enough to have positioned themselves correctly in the supply chain. The famous fifth, a full 20% of everything mined, goes straight to the crown as tax, which explains rather efficiently why the royal family can afford quite so much velvet. Walk past a goldsmith's workshop near the palace, and you'll hear the constant tap and scrape of tools shaping raw metal into altarpieces, jewellery, and devotional objects destined for churches so lavishly decorated they seem almost to be competing with heaven itself for attention. The smell of hot metal and beeswax drifts out into the street, mixing with incense from the nearest chapel. An oddly fitting combination for a city where faith and fortune have become nearly indistinguishable. Ever watched a sudden windfall, an inheritance, a lottery win, a bonus nobody expected, get spent almost instantly on things considerably fancier than anyone actually needed? Lisbon has been doing exactly that for decades, except the windfall arrives by ship every few months, and the fancy things in question are entire cathedrals. The human cost behind all this glittering wealth is severe, and it would be dishonest to gloss over it. The mines of Minas Gerais run on the forced labour of enslaved Africans, transported across the Atlantic in the same brutal trade that has enriched so much of colonial Europe,
worked under conditions that killed a great many of them long before their labour ever finished funding somebody's altarpiece back in Lisbon. The gold gleaming on a church ceiling here carries, quite literally, the weight of lives spent extracting it. A truth the glittering surfaces were never designed to advertise. The wealth has transformed Lisbon's skyline as thoroughly as it's transformed its economy, funding an ambitious wave of church building, palace expansion, and public spectacle that has made this city, for the moment, one of the most dazzling capitals on the continent. Whether that dazzle rests on a stable foundation is a question nobody in the city has any particular reason to be asking today. So you watch the chests carried up from the docks under armed escort, gold dust catching the afternoon light, and you understand precisely what fuels the gilding on every church, palace and opera house you've wandered past today. It came from very far away, at a very steep price, paid by people who never once got to see the beauty it eventually bought. Not everyone doing business here is Portuguese. English, Dutch, and other foreign merchants have set up shop along the docks, trading textiles and manufactured goods for something Portugal has in generous supply: wine. And the arrangement has made both sides extremely comfortable and only occasionally extremely drunk. Walk along the waterfront district, and you'll spot the English factory easily enough. Warehouses and trading houses flying flags that have no business being quite so prominent in a foreign capital, staffed by merchants who have settled in comfortably enough to have their own chaplain, their own social circle, and their own strong opinions about the local weather. The arrangement stems from a decades-old trade treaty that lets English wool and manufactured goods flow into Portugal duty-free, in exchange for Portuguese wine flowing back the other way at a favourable rate. A deal that has proven so mutually satisfying that both nations have simply kept renewing the spirit of it ever since. The warehouses themselves smell like a strange, layered argument between two entirely different countries. Damp English wool stacked beside barrels of Portuguese port, the sharp tang of fermenting grapes competing with the lanolin must of freshly imported cloth. Clerks move between the stacks with ledgers, tallying shipments in at least 2 languages simultaneously, while dock workers haul barrels toward waiting ships bound back across the Bay of Biscay. Ever watched 2 co-workers from completely different departments strike up an unlikely, oddly successful partnership purely because their skills happen to complement each other perfectly? That's essentially the entire Anglo-Portuguese trading relationship, except instead of a shared spreadsheet, they've built an actual permanent expatriate colony, and instead of coffee breaks, there's considerably more port wine involved. The English merchants here live well, comfortably wealthy off the arrangement, occupying handsome townhouses near the waterfront and maintaining a social life almost entirely separate from Portuguese high society. An expatriate bubble, complete with its own customs, its own gossip, and its own faint air of superiority that the locals mostly tolerate because the trade itself is simply too profitable to disrupt over hurt feelings. Dutch traders operate in similar fashion nearby, alongside smaller contingents from other nations, each carving out their own corner of the waterfront economy. Portuguese wine merchants, meanwhile, have grown wealthy supplying the demand, particularly a fortified variety from up the Douro River that travels well across long sea voyages without spoiling, a happy accident of production that has made it wildly popular among English drinkers, who appreciate a wine that survives the journey home roughly as well as they do. Entire fortunes on both sides of this trade rest on a drink most people involved are also, conveniently,
extremely fond of drinking themselves. The arrangement isn't without its tensions. Portuguese merchants occasionally grumble, quietly and mostly to each other, about foreign traders growing rich off Portuguese vineyards and Portuguese ships, while contributing rather less to Portuguese coffers than might feel fair. But the wine keeps flowing, the wool keeps arriving, and the profits keep everyone sufficiently comfortable that the grumbling rarely progresses past the grumbling stage. So you wander past the English warehouses, catching snatches of a language that sounds oddly familiar, layered under Portuguese shouted instructions, and you realise that Lisbon's wealth isn't only built on gold from across an ocean. Some of it is built on a rather simpler, older trade, dependable as ever. One country's excellent wine, and another country's excellent thirst for it. Let's talk about religion, because in Lisbon it is less a private matter and more the operating system for the entire city. Church bells mark the hours. Saints' feast days shut down entire neighbourhoods for parades, and a person could plan their whole week here simply by listening for which saint is being celebrated next. Churches seem to occupy every other street corner, ranging from modest neighbourhood chapels to soaring cathedrals dripping with the same Brazilian gold, funding the rest of the city's excess. Bells ring not just for services, but for the hours themselves, marking the rhythm of the day so thoroughly that most residents could tell you the approximate time without ever glancing at a clock, purely from muscle memory built over a lifetime of listening. Processions wind through the streets with genuine regularity, statues of saints carried aloft on the shoulders of the faithful, incense trailing behind in thick, fragrant clouds, choirs singing hymns that echo off the tight stone walls of neighbourhoods like Alfama, with a resonance no concert hall could properly replicate. Entire streets pause for these events, shopkeepers stepping into doorways, children hoisted onto shoulders for a better view, the whole city briefly reorganising itself around whichever saint has earned the calendar's attention that particular week. Ever tried explaining to someone from another country why an entire office shuts down for a public holiday nobody outside the region has heard of? Lisbon runs on roughly 40 of those a year, except instead of a long weekend, you get incense, hymns, and a very serious debate about whose neighbourhood carries the better procession route. Faith here isn't confined to Sundays or grand cathedrals.
It threads through daily life in smaller, quieter ways too. A quick sign of the cross passing a church doorway, a small shrine tucked into a street corner with a candle rarely allowed to burn out. A fisherman's wife praying over her husband's boat before he sets out, because the sea takes what it wants, regardless of how devout you've been that week. Religious confraternities organise charity, funerals, and festivals, forming a social safety net stitched together as much by faith as by formal institution. The sheer number of churches per capita in this city borders on the absurd, dozens upon dozens crammed into a relatively compact urban footprint, each parish fiercely proud of its own particular saint, its own particular relic, its own particular claim to spiritual importance over the parish one street over. Competitive piety, in its own way, has become something of a local sport. The clergy themselves hold enormous social influence, woven into court politics, education, and charity in ways that make the line between spiritual and civic authority pleasantly, if occasionally inconveniently, blurry. A cardinal's opinion can shape policy as readily as a minister's, and a well-timed sermon has ended more than one career at court. So you stand for a moment as another procession passes, gold vestments catching the sun, chanting rising and falling with the particular cadence only centuries of repetition can produce. And you understand that in this city, faith isn't simply observed. It's worn, practically, like a second layer of clothing, every bit as visible and every bit as mandatory as the black wool everyone's sweating through today. Behind the high walls of Lisbon's convents, a very different kind of devotion is taking place, one involving egg yolks, sugar, and recipes guarded more closely than some royal secrets. Nuns here have turned dessert making into something close to an art form, repurposing leftover egg yolks from a nearby industry into sweets famous well beyond the convent gates. The origin of this particular obsession is wonderfully practical. Convents and monasteries across the region have long used egg whites for a surprising variety of purposes, starching habits and religious linens to a crisp finish, and clarifying wine down at the local vineyards, which leaves behind an enormous, ever-renewing surplus of yolks that someone, somewhere down the centuries, had the genius idea not to waste. The result is an entire category of desserts built almost entirely around egg yolk, sugar, and whatever the sisters happen to have on hand. Step near a convent kitchen on a baking day, and the smell alone could lead you there blindfolded. Caramelized sugar, warm egg custard, and the faint scent of cinnamon or lemon rind drifting out through high barred windows. Behind those walls, small, delicate pastries take shape. Custard tarts with edges burnished nearly black from the heat of a wood oven, tiny egg yolk sweets rolled in sugar, dense little cakes made almost entirely from almonds and yolk, each convent guarding its particular recipe with the fierce secrecy of a state document. Ever had a family recipe passed down so jealously that even asking for the exact measurements felt like a minor social transgression? Multiply that instinct by several centuries of religious tradition and a genuine local rivalry between convents, and you get an entire dessert economy built on secrecy so serious that recipes have occasionally been sold to fund a struggling convent's survival, treated less like a cooking tip and more like a dowry. These sweets aren't merely a convent hobby either. They've become a genuine source of income for religious houses that otherwise rely on charity and modest land holdings, sold through convent gates or delivered to wealthy patrons in the city who consider a standing order of pastries from a particular convent something close to a status symbol. A noble household, proud of its convent connections, might serve these sweets at a dinner party, the way a modern host might proudly serve something imported and slightly hard to obtain. The names themselves carry a certain theatrical flourish, translating loosely to things like heavenly bacon, angel's cheeks, or nun's belly. Delightfully irreverent titles for treats made by women who have taken vows of considerable seriousness. There's a gentle, knowing humour buried in the naming, as if the sisters themselves were fully aware of the absurd contrast between their solemn calling and their genuinely excellent side hustle in sugar. So you accept a small pastry passed to you through a convent gate, still faintly warm, sugar crackling against custard, soft enough to nearly dissolve on contact. And you understand that behind every vow of poverty and quiet contemplation in this city, there is very often a truly excellent, jealously guarded dessert recipe, and absolutely no intention whatsoever of sharing it with you. Not every part of this city is gentle, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Rising over Rocio Square stands the headquarters of the Portuguese Inquisition, an institution that has spent well over 2 centuries policing belief itself, and its presence here is felt less as a rumour and more as a quiet, permanent weight in the air. The building itself, the Palace of the Estaus, sits at the edge of the square, looking almost unremarkable from the outside, which somehow makes its function all the more unsettling. Inside, tribunals have questioned, tried, and sentenced individuals suspected of straying from orthodox Catholic belief, with particular and sustained suspicion falling on those of Jewish ancestry, many of whom converted generations ago under considerable pressure, and have lived ever since under a lingering cloud of doubt about the sincerity of that conversion, passed down as suspicion from parent to child, regardless of how devoutly any individual actually practices. Public sentences, when they come, take the form of an auto da fe, a solemn, elaborate ceremony held right here in the square, complete with processions, sermons, and formal judgments read aloud before large crowds who gather the way a modern crowd might gather for a major public event. Except the stakes for those on trial are considerably graver than anything decided at a stadium. The severity of punishment ranges widely, from penance and fines to, in the most serious cases, execution. A grim public spectacle the city has, over generations, grown unnervingly accustomed to witnessing. Ever felt the low hum of anxiety that comes from knowing certain topics are simply not safe to bring up at a family gathering, let alone in public? Now imagine that anxiety extended across an entire nation, backed by a formal tribunal with the power to investigate your private beliefs. And you begin to understand the atmosphere this institution has cast over daily life here for generations. The Inquisition's reach extends well beyond formal trials. It shapes what books circulate, what conversations happen behind closed doors rather than in open company, and how carefully certain families guard their own history. Merchants and professionals from families with Jewish ancestry, generically and often unfairly labelled new Christians, face suspicion in business and social life, regardless of their own genuine faith. A prejudice baked so deeply into the city's social fabric that it rarely needs stating outright. There is real fear here, quiet and constant, but there is also, alongside it, ordinary life continuing to happen. Neighbours still gossip, children still play in the square, merchants still haggle over the day's prices, all within sight of a building that represents one of the era's more sobering realities. It's a genuinely uncomfortable contrast. The same square hosting both a lively morning market and, on certain grim occasions, a public sentencing. And there's no clever joke or tidy comparison that makes that particular truth easier to carry. So you walk past the Palace of the Estaus a little faster than you walked past the last building, saying nothing, because some parts of a place's history deserve simply to be witnessed honestly, without a punchline attached. And this is one of them. For entertainment, Lisbon turns to the bull ring, where mounted noblemen and skilled performers face down bulls in front of roaring crowds, a spectacle equal parts sport, status symbol, and public holiday. It is thrilling, dangerous, and taken about as seriously here as a modern championship game, minus the replay screens. The event itself draws crowds from every level of society. Nobles in their finest clothes occupying the better seats, tradesmen and their families crammed in wherever space allows. Everyone united for an afternoon in the shared, slightly nervous thrill of watching a very large animal decide, unpredictably, exactly how much patience it has left. The Portuguese style favours horsemanship above all. Skilled riders on beautifully trained horses executing precise, elegant manoeuvres around the bull. A display of control and nerve that turns what could be simple brutality into something closer to a dangerous, high-stakes ballet. The noise alone tells you everything about the mood. Roaring approval when a rider executes a particularly daring pass. Gasps sharp enough to silence an entire crowd when a horse comes within inches of a horn. And the low, continuous murmur of side bets being placed, renegotiated, and occasionally regretted in real time. Dust rises from the ring, mixing with the smell of trampled earth and nervous horse sweat, while vendors weave through the stands, hawking food and drink to a crowd too tense to remember they're hungry until someone waves a pastry directly under their nose. Ever watched a sporting event where the entire crowd seems to collectively hold its breath at the exact same moment, then explode into noise half a second later? That's the rhythm of an afternoon here, except instead of a ball crossing a line, the stakes involve a horse, a very large animal with horns, and a rider whose entire reputation rests on making the whole dangerous business look effortless. Status plays a significant role in who actually participates. Noblemen consider skilled horsemanship in the ring a genuine mark of prestige, an opportunity to display courage and grace in front of exactly the audience most likely to gossip about it afterward at court. Younger sons in particular, eager to prove themselves without a battlefield handy, find in the bullring a socially acceptable outlet for exactly the kind of reckless bravery that might otherwise get them into considerably more inconvenient trouble. The bulls themselves are bred specifically for the ring, raised on ranches with an eye toward temperament and power rather than any gentler qualities, and handled by experienced professionals whose entire livelihood depends on understanding an animal that has, understandably, no interest whatsoever in cooperating with the day's entertainment plans. It is dangerous work for everyone involved, animal and human alike, and injuries, while not the goal, are treated as an accepted cost of the spectacle, rather than any particular cause for alarm. So you find yourself gripping the rail a little tighter than you expected, swept up in the noise and dust and nervous energy of it all. And you understand, watching a rider execute one more impossibly close pass to another roar from the crowd, exactly why this afternoon pastime has held its grip on the city for as long as anyone here can remember. Let's talk about the newest, shiniest building in the entire city. Just a few months ago, King Jose I opened a brand new royal opera house down by the river. An extravagant temple to music and spectacle, built specifically to satisfy his personal love of the art form. And Lisbon's high society has barely stopped talking about it since. The building itself rises directly beside the Ribeira Palace, close enough to the water that ships passing on the Tagus can glimpse its ornate facade, designed by an Italian architect brought in specifically for the job. Because if you're going to build a monument to your own excellent taste in music, you may as well import the very best available expertise. Inside, tiers of gilded boxes rise around a stage built for genuinely spectacular productions. Elaborate scenery, trapdoors, and machinery capable of lowering gods from the heavens, quite literally, for the more ambitious performances. Attend a performance here, and you'll find the audience is very nearly as much the show as the stage itself. Noble families occupy private boxes dressed in their absolute finest, using the intervals between acts to observe, judge, and be observed in equal measure. Opera glasses employed as often for scanning the crowd as for actually watching the performers. The king himself attends with genuine, obvious enthusiasm, considerably more animated here than he tends to appear during the actual business of governing his kingdom. Ever noticed how certain cultural events seem to matter less for the art itself and more for who was seen attending? An opening night here carries exactly that energy, except instead of red carpet photographs, the social currency is a well-placed box seat and a very public, very deliberate nod toward a rival noble family across the theatre. The music itself draws heavily on Italian opera traditions, elaborate vocal performances, dramatic plots often drawn from classical mythology, and singers imported at considerable expense because the king's standards, much like his ceiling gilding, do not tolerate anything modest. Rehearsals run late into the evening, musicians and singers polishing every note under the anxious eye of a director keenly aware that royal disappointment is not a risk worth taking. The construction and ongoing operation of a building this lavish costs an enormous sum, funded easily enough by the steady flow of Brazilian gold still arriving at the docks each month, a fairly direct line from mine to opera stage that few in the audience pause to consider while enjoying the show. It stands, gleaming and new, as perhaps the single clearest physical symbol of exactly how much wealth this city currently commands, and exactly how eager its king is to spend it on beauty rather than anything more practical. So you watch the crowd file out after a performance, still buzzing with gossip about the evening's staging and the evening's seating arrangements in roughly equal measure. And you understand that this building represents Lisbon at its most confident, most extravagant, and most utterly convinced that an evening at the opera is a perfectly reasonable use of a king's ransom in gold. Given the hills, walking everywhere is exhausting, even by 18th century standards, so those who can afford it are carried instead, tucked into sedan chairs hoisted on the shoulders of hired bearers, while everyone else relies on mules and donkeys, who have clearly made peace with their life choices. A sedan chair itself looks something like an enclosed armchair with poles running along either side, curtained or windowed depending on the owner's taste and budget, carried by two strong men who have made a genuine profession out of hauling wealthy passengers up and down streets that would leave an ordinary person gasping within a single block. Passengers settle in, curtain drawn against dust or curious eyes, and simply wait, swaying gently, while someone else's legs do the considerable work of navigating this city's punishing geography. The bearers themselves are a common sight, stationed near busy squares and outside grand houses, calling out for custom the way a modern taxi driver might idle near a busy corner, ready to haggle briefly over the fare before hoisting the poles and setting off at a pace that somehow manages both speed and remarkable steadiness, despite streets that dip, twist, and occasionally include actual staircases. Ever paid for a taxi purely because the walk, while technically possible, would arrive you at your destination sweating through your shirt and questioning your life choices? Wealthy Lisboetas made peace with that exact logic centuries ago. They've simply outsourced the walking entirely to two men whose entire job description is essentially your personal set of legs for hire. Those without the means for a sedan chair rely instead on more traditional transport, mules and donkeys plodding through the narrow streets loaded with goods, occasionally a passenger perched awkwardly atop, ears pinned back with what can only be described as weary professional patience. These animals navigate the city's staircases and switchbacks with a sure-footedness that puts most human pedestrians to shame, having presumably long since given up hoping for a flatter assignment. Carts pulled by oxen handle the heavier cargo, hauling barrels, building stone, and market goods along the wider streets near the waterfront, though even here the hills impose their own limits, forcing much of the city's actual daily haulage onto human backs and animal patience rather than wheels, which struggle badly on inclines this steep and streets this narrow. The wealthy occasionally maintain private carriages as well, grander affairs than a simple sedan chair, though these remain largely confined to the broader streets near the palace and the newer squares, since the older, tangled quarters like Alfama were never built with wheeled traffic in mind at all. A carriage attempting those alleys would find itself wedged solid within the first turn, much to the entertainment of everyone watching from their windows. So you watch a sedan chair sway past, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, bearers moving with the steady rhythm of men who have made this exact climb 10,000 times before, and you understand that in a city built this stubbornly uphill, mobility itself has quietly become one more marker of exactly how much money you have, and exactly how much you're willing to pay to avoid using your own legs. Away from the palaces, the actual city runs on artisans, guild workers, and shopkeepers hammering, stitching, and shouting their way through the day. Cobblers, silversmiths, and tailors line the narrow streets, each trade clustered into its own tiny neighbourhood, so buying a pair of shoes doubles as a walking tour. Wander through these tradesmen's quarters and the city reveals an entirely different rhythm than the one you've encountered near the palace or the churches. Here, the soundtrack is hammers on metal, the rasp of saws through wood, the rhythmic slap of leather being worked by a cobbler's practiced hands, all layered under the constant chatter of apprentices, masters, and customers haggling over the price of a good pair of boots. Each guild jealously protects its own trade, controlling who may practice it, how goods must be made, and what quality standards a finished product has to meet before it can be sold under the guild's name. Becoming a master craftsman here is no small undertaking. A boy apprentices young, sometimes as early as 10 or 12, living and working under a master for years, learning the trade through repetition, correction, and the occasional well-deserved scolding, before eventually producing a masterpiece, quite literally a finished piece of work judged by senior guild members that determines whether he's earned the right to open his own shop or spend a few more years perfecting his craft under someone else's roof.
Ever spent years working your way up through an organisation, proving yourself at every single stage before finally earning a title that actually matched the work you'd been doing unofficially for ages? Guild apprenticeship runs on exactly that logic, except the final performance review involves an actual physical object judged by a room full of unsentimental experts, and there's no appealing the decision to human resources. The neighbourhoods themselves organise with a tidiness the rest of the city rarely bothers with. Silversmiths clustered along one particular street, their windows glinting with delicate jewellery and devotional pieces destined for the very churches you passed earlier. Tailors and cloth merchants a few streets over. The air there thick with the smell of new fabric and hot pressing irons. This clustering makes practical sense, sharing trade gossip, sharing suppliers, and giving customers an easy way to comparison shop without wandering the entire city. Prices and quality are tightly regulated by each guild, a kind of medieval consumer protection that keeps a dishonest cobbler from passing off shoddy leather as premium goods. At least in theory. Since human nature being what it is, complaints and disputes between guild members occasionally erupt into disputes considerably louder than the hammering that surrounds them daily. Women work these trades too, more often than official guild records tend to acknowledge, running shops, assisting husbands, and in some cases operating businesses independently as widows who inherited both a workshop and the skills to keep it running, quietly proving guild rules considerably more flexible in practice than they appear on paper. So you walk on past another workshop, sawdust and hot metal filling the air, a master shouting instructions at an apprentice who's clearly heard this particular lecture before. And you realise that behind every gilded church and grand palace in this city stands an entire economy of ordinary hands, working, arguing, and slowly, patiently earning their place. Close your eyes for a moment, if you dare, and just listen. Fish, incense, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and something distinctly less pleasant all compete for attention in the same narrow lane, layered under the constant clatter of hooves, bells, and half a dozen dialects shouting over each other. Open your eyes again, and the sound only gets more layered. A blacksmith's hammer rings out from one direction, steady and rhythmic, while somewhere closer, a fishwife's call cuts clean through everything else, sharp and musical and utterly unmistakable. Church bells arrive on their own separate schedule entirely, indifferent to whatever conversation they happen to interrupt. And beneath it all runs the low, constant murmur of a city simply going about its business.
footsteps on cobblestone, cartwheels grinding over uneven stone, a donkey braying its objections to absolutely everything. The smell shifts block by block in a way that tells its own map of the city. Salt and brine near the waterfront, giving way gradually to wood smoke and roasting meat as you climb toward the residential quarters. Then the sharper, less forgiving scent of the street's other business, drifting up from wherever last night's agua vai warning went unheeded. Incense drifts from open church doors, sweet and heavy, cutting briefly through everything else before dissolving back into the general haze of a city that has never once considered ventilation a civic priority. Taste finds its way into the experience too, if you let it. A pastry snatched from a street vendor, still warm enough to burn your fingers. Sugar and egg custard, giving way to the sharp saltiness of the sea air itself, which seems to settle on your tongue, no matter how far you've wandered from the actual water. Even breathing here carries a faint mineral tang, salt riding in on the breeze off the Tagus, mixing with the smoke of 100 separate cooking fires. Ever walked through a busy market abroad and found your senses genuinely overwhelmed within the first 5 minutes? So much happening at once that your brain simply gives up trying to catalogue it all and settles for vague, general delight instead. Lisbon operates at that exact pitch pretty much constantly, an assault on the senses so total and so relentless that visitors either fall in love with it immediately or retreat to the nearest quiet chapel within the hour. Texture matters too, in its own quiet way. Rough cobblestones underfoot that never quite let your feet relax, the cool smoothness of a church's stone doorway offering brief relief from the heat, the scratch of wool against your skin in weather that really deserves considerably lighter fabric. Even the sunlight itself seems to have a texture here, thick and golden, in a way that makes the whitewashed walls practically glow by mid-afternoon. So you stand still for just a moment longer, letting the whole overwhelming sensory tangle of the city wash over you at once. Fish and incense and hammering metal and distant singing. And you understand, finally and completely, that no single sense could ever properly capture this place. You need every single one of them working at full capacity, all at the same time, just to keep up. Alongside the official religion of the churches runs a second, quieter one, made of charms, patron saints for very specific problems, and small rituals nobody would ever call superstition to a priest's face. A fisherman's wife might pray to one saint for safe passage and quietly touch a charm for good measure, just in case. This parallel world of belief operates comfortably alongside official church teaching, rarely in open conflict with it, more often simply layered gently on top, a kind of practical insurance policy for whichever problem the moment demands. Certain saints have earned reputations for handling extremely specific concerns, one for safe childbirth, another for lost objects, another still, unsurprisingly given the city's relationship with the sea, for sailors and fishermen facing the genuine daily possibility of not coming home. A household might keep a small shrine to more than one, hedging its spiritual bets the way a sensible person hedges any other kind of risk. Small charms and blessed objects circulate widely, worn under clothing or tucked into a pocket, a scrap of blessed cloth, a tiny medal, occasionally an object with origins considerably older and less strictly Catholic than the Church would probably prefer to acknowledge. Folk traditions that predate the current religious order by centuries, quietly absorbed, rather than fully erased. A wise grandmother in any given household tends to know precisely which remedy, which charm, which whispered phrase handles which particular kind of bad luck. Knowledge passed down as casually and confidently as a good recipe. Ever kept a slightly irrational personal ritual? Knocking on wood, avoiding a particular number, carrying a lucky object to an important meeting, while simultaneously being a perfectly rational modern adult who knows better. That instinct hasn't gone anywhere in several hundred years. Lisbon in 1755 is simply more honest about it, weaving these small private rituals openly into daily life rather than pretending they don't exist. Fishing communities in particular maintain an entire unofficial calendar of protective customs. Specific prayers said before a boat departs, particular saints invoked depending on the season or the destination, small offerings left at shoreline shrines by wives and mothers who have very good, very personal reasons for wanting every possible form of protection stacked in their favour. The sea here is generous and merciless in roughly equal measure, and nobody sending a husband or son out onto it feels the least bit embarrassed about covering every spiritual base available.
Healers and wise women operating somewhere in the flexible space between folk medicine and outright faith healing treat everyday ailments with herbal remedies, blessed water, and a firm, comforting confidence that combines genuine medical knowledge with something considerably harder to categorize. The line between doctor, priest, and grandmother's remedy blurs pleasantly here, nobody particularly interested in drawing it too sharply, as long as the patient actually recovers. So you watch a woman pause at a small street corner shrine, murmuring something too quiet to catch, touching a small charm at her throat before continuing on her way without a second thought. And you understand that faith in this city was never confined to Sunday Mass and grand cathedrals. It lives quietly in pockets and around necks and murmured under breath, everywhere, all the time, just in case. For all its gold, Lisbon is not a city of equally distributed wealth. Beggars sit in the shadow of churches dripping in gilt, noble carriages roll past children with nothing, and the gap between the two is treated less as a scandal and more as simply the shape the world has always taken. Walk the streets near any of the grander churches and you'll find beggars stationed at the entrances, some genuinely destitute, others disabled or elderly with no other means of support. A few simply fallen on hard times in a city where the gap between comfortable and desperate can shrink alarmingly fast. Charity here is considered a genuine religious duty, and almsgiving happens regularly enough that a beggar stationed at a popular church entrance on a feast day can do reasonably well. Though reasonably well in this context still means considerably less than reasonable by any modern standard. Noble carriages and sedan chairs pass through these same streets without much apparent friction, the enormously wealthy and the entirely destitute sharing the same narrow lanes purely because Lisbon's geography leaves no other option. There's no separate district cordoning off poverty from privilege, no gated avenue reserved exclusively for the comfortable. Everyone simply funneled through the same steep, narrow streets, regardless of how much gold currently sits in their household. Ever walked past someone clearly struggling on your way into an expensive shop, felt a brief flicker of discomfort, then kept walking because that's simply how the day was structured? That exact tension plays out here constantly, except with rather less social pressure to look away. Poverty and privilege existing in far closer, far more visible proximity than most modern cities would ever tolerate. Religious institutions provide what limited formal safety net exists,
confraternities and convents distributing bread, running small hospitals, and organising charity for widows, orphans, and the sick. An uneven patchwork that helps considerably more than nothing while falling well short of anything resembling a genuine social system. The Crown occasionally intervenes with grain distribution during particularly hard years, though such measures tend to be reactive rather than any kind of sustained policy. Class itself is worn almost as visibly as clothing. The fine, dark fabrics of a noble's outfit instantly distinguishable from the rougher, patched garments of a labourer, servants recognisable by their livery, tradesmen by the particular calluses and stains their work leaves behind. Social mobility exists, but moves slowly and rarely. A successful merchant family might, over several generations, purchase enough respectability and land to inch toward the edges of nobility, though the established aristocracy guards the actual boundary with predictable, stubborn precision. There's no illusion here, among rich or poor, that the current arrangement is temporary or destined to change soon.
The wealthy accept their fortune as more or less ordained. The poor accept their hardship with a resignation that occasionally shades into genuine faith that reward, if it comes at all, will arrive in a considerably more permanent form than gold. So you pass a beggar, seated patiently outside a church, glittering with the very wealth that built it, and a noble's carriage rattles by without so much as a glance in either direction. And you understand, watching the two coexist within the same few feet of cobblestone, that this city's beauty and its inequality were never separate stories. They were, from the very beginning, built from precisely the same gold. Even after the sun goes down, Lisbon doesn't fully quiet itself. There is no real street lighting to speak of, so the wealthy retreat behind shuttered windows while everyone else contends with straw mattresses, close quarters, and the small nightly battle against whatever insect life has claimed squatters' rights in the bedding. Darkness here arrives total and immediate the moment the sun dips behind the hills. Streets that were crowded and loud an hour earlier, suddenly reduced to pools of candlelight, glimpsed through shuttered windows, and the occasional lantern carried by a servant sent out on some late errand. Venturing outside after dark, without a light of your own, is a genuinely risky proposition. Uneven cobblestones invisible underfoot, the ever-present possibility of an unannounced agua vai from somewhere overhead, and the entirely reasonable concern that thieves prefer the same darkness you're currently stumbling through. Wealthier households retreat into candlelit interiors, wax candles for those who can afford the pleasant, relatively smoke-free glow, cheaper tallow for everyone else, casting a dimmer, smokier light that carries its own distinctive smell, faintly like a butcher's shop crossed with a campfire. Servants bank the household fire, latch the shutters, and the family settles into whatever evening routine the household maintains. Prayers, quiet conversation, needlework by candlelight, the occasional book for those fortunate enough to be literate and awake enough to still care. For those without the luxury of a private bedroom, sleeping arrangements grow considerably more communal. A single room might house an entire family, straw mattresses arranged close together for warmth as much as for space, blankets shared and reshared as the night grows cooler. Privacy, that particular modern obsession, simply doesn't factor into the equation when square footage is this precious and firewood
this expensive. Ever lain awake at 3 a.m, convinced something was crawling across your leg, only to realise, with a mix of relief and disgust, that you were right? That particular experience was less an occasional horror here, and more a nightly certainty. Straw mattresses, however carefully maintained, offer excellent accommodation to fleas, bedbugs, and whatever else has decided your household makes for agreeable lodging. And the nightly scratch and shift routine is simply factored into everyone's understanding of what sleep involves. Night watchmen patrol certain streets, carrying lanterns and calling out the hour. A human alarm clock cum security system combined. Their calls occasionally the only sound cutting through the darkness, besides a distant dog, a fussing infant, or the creak of a shutter easing open, just far enough for someone to check whether the coast is clear for a discreet late errand. The wealthy sleep in proper beds, with actual mattresses, sometimes even feather-stuffed for those who've truly arrived, tucked behind curtains that offer both warmth and a small, hard-won measure of privacy from servants moving quietly through the household on their own late errands. It is, in every sense, a considerably softer landing than straw, and everyone in the household knows precisely whose bed that particular comfort belongs to. So you finally settle in yourself, rope frame creaking beneath you, blanket pulled close against the night chill, doing your level best to ignore whatever small creature has just claimed a portion of your mattress as its own personal territory. And you drift towards sleep in a city that has, for the moment, finally, mercifully quieted itself. Step back for a moment and look at how this whole city is actually built. Grand stone churches rise beside tightly packed wooden houses stacked one against the next, much of it resting on soft riverside sediment, while the oldest hillside neighbourhoods sit on solid bedrock. Nobody walking these streets today gives that particular detail a second thought. The construction methods here reflect centuries of steady, incremental growth rather than any single unified plan. Buildings added, expanded, and rebuilt generation after generation, as the city's population and wealth both swelled. Along the waterfront and in the newer, grander districts, tall, multi-storey buildings rise 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories high, packed tightly together along narrow streets, upper floors occasionally leaning out slightly over the lane below, a construction quirk that maximises living space at the inconvenient cost of blocking out quite a lot of daylight from the street underneath. Much of this newer construction sits on ground that was, not so very long ago, simply part of the riverbed itself. Soft, loose sediment reclaimed and built upon as the city expanded outward toward the water to make room for its growing population and its growing appetite for grand waterfront palaces. The older neighbourhoods, Alfama chief among them, sit instead on considerably firmer footing. Solid rock that has anchored buildings there since long before the current king's ancestors ever wore a crown. Ever noticed how a newer housing development, all shiny and quickly built, sometimes develops odd cracks and creaks within just a few years, while some stubborn old farmhouse down the road has stood solid for a century without complaint? There's a similar quiet distinction humming beneath this city right now, one nobody currently has any particular reason to think about, between the ground the newer grandeur rests on and the ground beneath the older, humbler quarters. Materials vary considerably by neighbourhood and by budget. Stone predominates for churches, palaces, and the homes of the genuinely wealthy, heavy and durable, but exceptionally expensive to work with at any real scale. Most ordinary housing, instead, relies heavily on timber framing, filled in with rubble, brick or mortar, a cheaper and faster method that has allowed the city to expand rapidly to house its growing population, though it comes with its own set of trade-offs that nobody currently building this way is spending much time worrying over. Street surfaces are narrow by design in the older quarters, partly a legacy of the city's Moorish-influenced layout, partly simple practicality. Tight streets offer shade against the brutal summer sun and shelter from the wind, even as they create exactly the kind of tightly packed, densely populated conditions that make evacuating quickly, in any kind of emergency, a genuinely difficult proposition. None of this troubles a single soul wandering these streets today. Buildings have stood for generations, churches have weathered centuries, and the general operating assumption, entirely reasonable given the evidence available, is that Lisbon, as it currently stands, will simply continue standing, indefinitely, the way it always has. There's no particular reason, this pleasant afternoon, to think otherwise. So you walk on past another handsome stone facade, admiring the craftsmanship without a second thought for what lies beneath it, and the city carries on exactly as it has for centuries, magnificent, densely packed, and entirely, understandably, unaware of anything the ground beneath it might eventually have to say about all this.
Before we let this night close, take one last look from the hillside, down over the rooftops, the ships, the gold-heavy churches, and the river catching the last light of the day. This is Lisbon exactly as it stands right now, magnificent, overcrowded, and utterly convinced that tomorrow will look very much like today. From up here, the whole sprawling, contradictory city arranges itself into something almost peaceful. Red rooftops tumble down toward the water in uneven waves, church towers rising above them at irregular intervals, like exclamation points scattered across a very long sentence. Smoke drifts up lazily from 100 separate kitchen fires, gulls wheel above the harbour, and somewhere far below, faint and softened by distance, the ordinary noise of the city continues exactly as it has all day. A fishwife's call, a hammer on metal, a bell marking some hour nobody up here particularly needs to know. The ships still crowd the harbour, patient as ever, waiting their turn to unload another shipment of gold, wine or sugar into a city that has learned to absorb enormous wealth with a casualness that would astonish almost anywhere else in Europe. The Ribeira Palace catches the last orange light of the afternoon along its long riverside facade, windows glinting, utterly unbothered, exactly as it has every evening for as long as anyone currently alive can remember. Ever stood somewhere beautiful at the end of a long, overwhelming day and felt the specific, quiet gratitude of simply having gotten to witness it? That's roughly where you find yourself now, legs aching from the hills, senses thoroughly worn out from the noise and the smell and the sheer relentless texture of the place, and still, somehow, glad you came. Down in Rossio, the evening crowd is thinning, merchants closing shutters, a few last stragglers hurrying home before full darkness makes the streets properly treacherous. Somewhere in Alfama, a guitar has already started up, low and unhurried, drifting out an open window the way it does most evenings,
indifferent to whoever happens to be listening. The convents have gone quiet behind their high walls, ovens cooling from the day's baking, sugar and eggs already set aside for tomorrow's fresh batch of secrets. The Inquisition's palace sits dark and silent at the square's edge, a shadow among the evening's gentler shadows, a part of this city's story that asks to be remembered honestly rather than fondly. None of it, from up here, looks the least bit fragile. The gold keeps arriving, the bells keep ringing. The hills remain exactly as steep as they were this morning, and the whole magnificent, uneven, gorgeous sprawl of red roof and gilded church and salt-heavy air looks, from this vantage point, every bit as permanent as everyone living inside it currently, confidently, entirely reasonably believes it to be. So you take one final long look, the light fading gold to violet over the water, and you let yourself simply enjoy it, exactly as it is, right now, on this particular evening, in the spring of the year 1755. Whatever comes later belongs to another night's story. Tonight, Lisbon is simply, gloriously, itself. So that was a single day and night in Lisbon, in the spring of 1755, back when this city stood at the absolute height of its own confidence. You climbed hills that seemed to personally resent you. You dodged falling water you'd really rather not think too hard about. You ate salt cod rescued from a bucket, admired gold that travelled further than most of the people who mined it ever would, and fell asleep to bells, guitars, and something small in the mattress that had made itself very much at home. It was gorgeous, it was gilded, and it was, in more quiet corners than the postcards would ever admit, genuinely unfair to the people whose backs it was built on. The varinas carrying fish uphill for miles, the water carriers hauling barrels for strangers who'd never learn their names, the people the grand churches quietly excluded, and the people whose labour an ocean away paid for every gleaming altar in the city. Lisbon in 1755 was, in the truest sense, a place of both wonder and weight, and it deserves to be remembered honestly, holding both at once. So tonight, as you sink into your own quiet bed, plumbing intact, roof unshaken, ceiling exactly where you left it, maybe send a small thank you to the fishwives and water carriers and nameless craftsmen who kept a city this beautiful actually running. And maybe, too, a quiet thought for the Lisbon of that particular spring, gilded, hopeful, and utterly unaware of what the ground beneath it was already, patiently, planning. Because that's the strange gift of looking back like this. It reminds you that people everywhere, in every century, have carried impossible loads up impossible hills, and somehow still found reason to sing while they did it. Sleep well. Lisbon certainly earned its rest tonight, too.